I'm Craig Murison from Lloyds Banking Group. I've got the honour of chairing tonight's meeting, and a very warm welcome to you all for tonight's discussion of the snappily titled Recalculation of the Solvency II Transitional Measures on Technical Provisions paper by the TMTP Working Party. And I guess, this has been a very hot topic for a lot of us involved in Solvency II, and it now represents a huge component of the Solvency II balance sheet for a huge number of UK insurers. And I guess the treatment and calculation of the transitionals is evolving rapidly. It's now actually pretty complicated, which you may have figured out already if you weren't involved in it just by reading the paper. And that's, I guess, raises a number of questions about the practicalities of calculation and maintaining that going forward. We've also seen some potential material changes in the way in which it will be calculated as at the end of 2017 due to some guidance from PRA during the year on the application of one leg of it called the FRR test, and that's something that the speakers will come on to, but that's quite an interesting development too. And I guess it raises interesting questions about the use of transitionals generally as an ALM tool. How should your risk appetite statements reflect the transitional benefit that you take onto your balance sheet, and how should it reflect the fact that they then run over time? And then finally, I guess, looking a bit further forward, might we see even further change, whether it's through simplification or political change through Brexit? What might that mean for the calculation of the transitionals over the next few years? So I think there's quite a lot of material there that all knits together, and so it'll be very interesting to hear what our two speakers have got to say about that. So if we turn to the two speakers that I've introduced, firstly Susan Morgan on the far left. Susan has been with Prudential since 2010 in a variety of different Solvency II related roles, and she's currently the Solvency II controller and responsible for first line governance of the internal capital model. She's also a member of the Life, Solvency and Capital Management Research Group, which she tells me beforehand has been running for 10 years in its current guise, so that deserves a bit of an award. And that group has produced papers on practical implementation challenges for internal models and expert judgment. So I think Susan's clearly very well placed to give us some input in this. And then to my immediate left we have Andy Rogan. Andy, who works beside me at Lloyds, has worked there for a very long time and has covered a variety of roles over that period, from with profits to capital optimisation, to now being the senior manager within the ALM team with responsibility for annuity ALM. And I think Andy would have said his biggest challenge in life prior to transitionals coming along was trying to keep positive watching Newcastle United or looking after his young son, but transitionals have now surpassed that well and truly. So I think with that, I'll hand over to Susan, who's going to introduce the paper.
So tonight's actually the first time that Andy and I have met, and it's not because we're being antisocial actuaries, it's because the working party members are spread quite across the UK, and when we were producing this paper, which took at least 6 to 9 months, we were meeting fortnightly and at least weekly via telephone conferences. So Andy and I would also like to take this opportunity tonight to thank the other members of the working party for their input into tonight's presentation and the paper itself. So if we go on to the agenda, I'm going to cover what is the TMTP, which is what I'll refer to it now, why firms have the TMTP, how it's calculated, and then Andy will go on to talk about how the TMTP is recalculated and also recent changes, particularly from the PRA. So you could view section 1 to 3 as being the support act, me, and Andy as being the actual main event, given the topic for this evening being the recalculation. So what is the TMTP? It allows your Solvency II technical provisions to be reduced, and that reduction runs off linearly from the date that Solvency II came into effect on the 1st of January 2016 for 16 years. It largely allows your balance sheet to be broadly equivalent to your Solvency I balance sheet on day one. It came into force as a result of the long-term guarantees package as part of Omnibus 2, which amended the original Solvency I directive. For those of you that are interested in knowing the specific rules, it's Article 308D in the Level 1 directive, and that was taken and put into UK law in 2015 as part of the statutory instrument number 575, and it was section 54. And it's within that statutory instrument that you actually see issues with double runoff coming in, which Andy might briefly touch on later. There's very little information in the Solvency II rules about the TMTP in general, so the PRA have actually issued a couple of supervisory statements that go with it. They issued number 17 in 2015, and then they issued another supervisory statement in 2016, that was number 6, which they actually updated in April of this year when they issued policy statement 11. So why do firms have a TMTP? The Working Party thinks that one of the key reasons for having a TMTP is to deal with the material difference between the Solvency II technical provisions and Solvency I ICA of the risk margin. For annuity writers in particular, the risk margin can add between 10 and 25% to your best estimate liabilities. The 25% is largely relating to the deferred annuity part of non-profit annuities. There are other reasons for differences between Solvency II and Solvency I. A couple of key ones being contract boundaries, and then differences with the risk-free rate under Solvency II and the discount rate that you might have used under Solvency I. It's actually very helpful because on day one, you could have had quite a big strain on your balance sheet that would have been detrimental to the ability to write new business or to pay dividends. And it could have made firms take management actions that they wouldn't otherwise had to take under the Solvency I regime. One of the other things that I should mention there before going on the slide is the phasing in plan. So if you can't actually cover your SCR under Solvency II without the use of a TMTP, you're required to submit a phasing in plan to the PRA. That plan sets out the actions that you're going to take to allow for the write-down of the transitional over the period of 16 years. You'll need to submit an annual update to the PRA on how you're progressing against that plan. And if for any reason you have a material change in risk profile and you were applying for a recalculation of the TMTP, you would also have to provide the PRA with an update on that phasing in plan. So how's it calculated? There are 3 main steps to the calculation. The first step is to compare your Solvency II technical provisions of best estimate liabilities and risk margin to your ICA market consistent liabilities. Those ICA MCL need to include any ICG that you got on your technical provisions from the PRA when the previous regime was in effect. This step in the calculation only applies to business that was in force when Solvency II came into effect, so pre-1st January 2016 business. You also didn't have to apply for all business on your book. You could apply for subsets of the business, but if you did apply for a subset, you had to demonstrate that those all had similar risk characteristics, so they were known as homogeneous risk groups. The next step is what Craig referred to, the FRR test, which is the financial resources requirement. It requires you to ensure that once you've applied a TMTP, you don't end up in a position that would have been better had you been under the Solvency I regime. So you can't have lower liabilities and capital than you would have had previously. Unlike the first step, which only has you looking at Solvency I Pillar 2, the ICA part, this step 2, the FRR test, requires you to compare your Solvency II capital and liability requirements to the more onerous of Solvency I Pillar 1 or ICA. Another difference to step 1 is that the PRA recently, as part of the PS 1117 update, stated that this part of the test needs to allow for all business. So not just the business that was written pre-1116. That actually has a consequence where you can make your FRR test bite less purely by writing new business that's more onerous under Solvency II than it was under Solvency I. And Andy's going to cover that in a wee bit more detail later on. So the final step in the calculation is actually to compare step 1 and step 2 to get your final TMTP. An alternative way to think about this is to actually do step 2 excluding the existence of the TMTP, and that way when you get to step 3 you're just looking at the minimum of your step 1 unrestricted transitional and what the difference between your capital requirements were under Solvency II and Solvency I. So I shall now hand over to Andy.
Thank you, Susan, and good evening, everybody. Susan, you're probably not aware that I reached a landmark birthday last month, and I can safely say that in my just over 40 years on this planet, I don't think anybody's ever called me the main event. So thank you. Susan's kind of done a bit of a preamble on what our paper's all about, and I'm going to talk to you about how to calculate the TMTP. I did get a last-minute request to make it entertaining. I will do my level best, but I am talking about the recalculation of the TMTP after all, so I'm not sure I'll be able to achieve that necessarily. Way back in 2015, everybody was working hard to get the balance sheets ready for Solvency II. Internal models approved, matching adjustment approvals, transitional approvals as well being sought. Lots of hard work by everybody just to get a transitional onto the day 1 balance sheet. So, job done. It'll just run off nicely. Well, that's not quite the case. There's a couple of instances where that linear runoff just doesn't apply, or we need to do something differently. First of all, regulations allow a change following a change in risk profile. That requires an application to the PRA. It couldn't cover a number of reasons, things like Part 7s, reinsurance arrangements, matching adjustment approvals if you haven't got one already, and also change in operating conditions. As Susan mentioned, there was a supervisory statement came out in 2016, supervisory statement 616, which gave a bit of guidance around those material change in profiles and what kind of triggers the PRA might look to expect. And they helpfully or unhelpfully gave an explicit criteria that generally recalculations would only be allowed if it was a result of a 5% or greater change in solvency ratio. So that's all very well. We're still in 2016. Everybody's kind of taken a breather for after getting Solvency II over the line, and then along comes Brexit, resulted in sharp falls in interest rates. Firms' risk margins rocketed, and that resulted in a pretty significant number of applications to PRA to recalculate the transitionals, 16 out of 33 firms that had a approval to hold a transitional in the first place. Recalculations are also relevant now in the run-up to year-end production of Solvency II balance sheets, to the extent that PRA recently clarified that the expectation to firms to do a recalculation every 2 years, and that's every 2 years from the date of Solvency II implementation, not 2 years from the date of last recalculation. So all those 16 companies that recalculated just over a year ago will be recalculating again 18 months from their last recalculation in most cases. The working party kind of set up, was it maybe April time in 2016, to start actually thinking about how we recalculate again, with the idea that we probably had a bit of time to think about how we would pull this paper together, but as I say, other political events seem to overtake us a little bit. But continued we did, and we pulled together the paper that was released a couple of months ago, and hopefully that's an interesting read for you all. Okay, so when we first started the Working Party, we identified a number of themes that we thought we should look at in more detail. There's an interesting one which I think both Susan and Craig have alluded to, and that's around segregation of business, particularly for kind of pre and post 2016 business. We have to segregate for the purpose of calculating the unrestricted transitional, and recent guidance from the PRA states that we shouldn't segregate for the FRR calculation. Segregation of business is no easy thing to do, and could require a lot of work depending on how your systems and processes are structured. There's also this bit about everybody was excited about bringing in their new WYSI internal models that were super efficient and calculated everything perfectly first time, and they could jettison old models, etc., and just look forward. That's not really the case for the recalculation of the TMTP. Firms will have to hold on to some form of legacy models. The degree to which they need to hold these will depend on their policy and materiality, but it's certainly an overhead for the industry. The Working Party also felt that the transitional recalculations should be proportionate. We didn't feel it was practical for every firm to go out and do a full recalculation of their ICA balance sheet and their Solvency I Pillar 1 balance sheet every time they wanted to recalculate a transitional. There had to be some easier way to do this that was materially correct. And the other thing as well is that we identified transitionals are firm specific. Susan mentioned that we spent an awful long time writing this paper, 6 to 9 months. Hopefully we've given you some great examples of how we might recalculate certain aspects of the transitional. Certainly I think if we went down every branch of every tree to cover every single possibility, I suspect we probably wouldn't have published the paper in the transitional's lifetime of 16 years. So yeah, horses for courses very much. So next we'll just talk about a few kind of key aspects of the recalculation, kind of key drivers of the differences between the Solvency I and Solvency II regimes. I quite like these examples insofar as first one kind of risk margin gives you an example of something that's new for Solvency II. Second example is something that's a bit similar but different between regimes. And the third one is certainly something that many of you will love or hate from the previous regime. So risk margin, quite possibly biggest component of the transitional, very material, very sensitive to interest rates as we all experienced in 2016. It does need to be segregated, certainly for the unrestricted calculation. There's a whole load of thought to be put there about, well, how do you segregate, what do you do with the increments, how do you carve up your non-market risk capital requirements. That's where your full risk margin is probably diversified across all your business. Some of the parts aren't the parts of the sum, etc. So a lot to think about. Potential solutions, just go away and build a very complicated model that does it. That could be onerous, depending on how your data and systems work. There's potential maybe to be a bit more proportionate, maybe looking at your 116 model and doing some adjustments to that, maybe risk-free rate changes or such like. Again, a pretty material component of the transitional, so something to take very seriously and to make sure you do something that's appropriate. Illiquidity premium differences, so this is kind of talking about where we have matching adjustment under Solvency II and we have a illiquidity premium over under Solvency I Pillar 2. Very similar but different, all about making some kind of default deduction to bond yields or corporate bond yields or such like. Some practical things to be thought about there. Matching adjustment is uses EIOPA-defined deductions. Liquidity premium under ICA typically uses an internal view. How do you keep that internal view alive in a proportionate manner? You've also got things like the fact that MA is a bit stricter on asset eligibility. So there's a bit of a theoretical debate to be had about, well, we've got these assets on the balance sheets that we think work well under Solvency II matching adjustment, but would we really hold them under ICA? And actually other assets that we would want to hold under ICA that we do not hold under Solvency II. So interesting things to resolve there. Obviously the map as well is, our matching adjustments is, you have a matching adjustment portfolio which is ring-fenced fund under Solvency II. Do you have to go down the route of holding 4 portfolios? For hypothecations of your matching assets pre and post 2016, and then MA and ILP only. Maybe that's a bit overkill. Maybe you can just look to your portfolio overall and pick the relevant assets under each regime. Maybe that's a simplification that is a sensible one to adopt. Finally, hangover from the old regime, there's a couple of these, ICA closure expenses as well. Obviously, any kind of ICG that applies under the ICA is essentially a drag on the transitional. It's possibly also a drag in having to recalculate it under transitionals, and you have to think about how you go about doing that. What one method might be to align your ICA assumptions to Solvency II. You might think that that would remove the ICG from your ICA numbers, but that obviously needs some approval from PRA. PRA have said that they're interested in understanding how the ICG is recalculated under a TMT recalculation. They will review it on a proportionate basis, but as many will know, it's the PRA who have calculated ICG in the past, so actually trying to work out how they do it and then apply it is also a bit of a challenge. I mean, there's many ways to do it. You can be very thorough, and that might be appropriate if you have a particularly large ICG, or you may do something a bit more proportionate where your ICG is some function of a risk exposure, and then maybe you can use your Solvency II SCR to approximate it. Okay, so recent changes. In April 2017, PRA issued a policy statement 1117, which was a refresh and update of the supervisory statement of the previous year. So I'll just kind of call out some of the big ticket items from that. So PRA have stated recalculations should be based on up-to-date information, credible best estimate assumptions. Assumptions should be consistent, so that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be doesn't necessarily mean it has to be an equalization across Solvency II and Solvency I. You just have to make sure that it is appropriate and that your ICG is appropriate there. There's an interesting one here about the amount of TMT to be applied, and PRA have clarified that the recalculated transitional is actually an upper bound. on the amount that you can post on your balance sheet, so you can reduce that if you so wish. Of course, if and that might be to reflect the true underlying value of the transitional at any point of time, given its irregular recalculation nature. Of course, if your transitional reduces, or your underlying transitional reduces below the triggers in your to recalculate, then you'd have to recalculate and recalculate the upper bound. But that's something that's interesting. It's kind of an asymmetric dynamic recalculation of sorts. Something that we discuss. Dynamic recalculation is something we discuss in our working party paper. Other interesting point is the author and that for an effective risk management process or policy, the TMTP should be recalculated under a range of stress and scenarios in the author, and that too provides that there's an overhead there, operational overhead, both in terms of recalculating the thing under stress, but also maybe allowing for it in your projections as well. So some interesting stuff there. Possibly the most interesting one is around the FRR test, or the kind of the how we would apply the restriction if one applies. And I think both Susan and Craig have alluded to this one as well. Interestingly, I was privy to a survey from a well-known consultancy recently, and they surveyed firms around how they approached the FRR and whether they allowed for post-2016 business and the recalculation of it. And this is before the supervisory statement the policy statement came out, and just probably about 70% said that they did not allow for it in their recalculation. However, the policy statement from the PRA clarifies that you should allow for new business in the calculation of the FRR. So there's a couple of charts here that kind of show what this means, or the difference between including and excluding it. The graph on my right, your left, shows the runoff of the transitional, just assuming a flat runoff, if post-2016 business is not allowed for in the FRR. And what you can see there is, and also that the FRR is the biting constraint. And what you can see is that the unrestricted transitional runs off to zero over 16 years, and so does the unrestricted transitional as well, and it's quite a nice linear runoff there. The restricted transitional is always the biting constraint. Now, if you go to the table on your right, this is a table that assumes that the business leaving the books, I guess, is offset by new business coming on. So we're looking at the FRR, including all business, including that post-2016. And what we see is the restricted TMTP remaining flat for 5 or so years, and then actually the unrestricted transitional takes over. And these graphs actually referring to the name of the transitionals. I know the names are a bit confusing in terms of how the graph works there, but on the left we have a flat line, and then we start to go down the diagonal. And what you can see between the two methods is that, you know, over the fullness of time, you're probably going to get to the point where your unrestricted transitional bites and you run off in a timely manner. But what it does mean is that in the short term, a lot of firms will now get some form of capital relief, certainly on the risk margin on the new business that they write. Again, what are the implications of that? Well, it means that shareholders probably get their dividends a bit sooner for a few years, and also some companies may decide to reflect this benefit in their pricing and may win more business if they choose to do that. So an interesting dynamic, and I'm not sure if it's necessarily intended consequence of the transitional when it was first brought up. or devised. So moving on to remaining challenges. It is a complex calculation. It takes an awful lot of time and effort to produce. It is the difference between two very large numbers. Complexity, every time a firm does a major model change or some kind of change of business, then immediate light bulb has to be, so what is the impact on transitionals? Do I need to recalculate? What do I need to do here? And, for example, if you have a Part 7 coming on and you're trying to work out what your new transitional should be, you might be in a situation where the transferring business may well not have the information you need to do that full recalculation. So lots of things to think about there. There's an opportunity cost associated with the transitional. It takes up a lot of management time and resources, reporting to boards, etc. Applications which can take a long time to write and even longer to get approved. There's a significant overhead in just actually managing the transitional, and some may think that it's maybe a bit of a distraction in actually running your business in a Solvency II world. Mentioned the application process again, a potentially laborious task. The working party suggested that the transitional recalculation under a change in operating conditions should be more dynamic. So when we see interest rates move around, ideally we would have a policy in place with agreed with the PRA, and if the triggers in that policy are met, we just get on and recalculate. There would be certainly benefits there in terms of time taken to apply. It'd be potentially easier to explain to management and also in external disclosures as well. One thing that was very pleasing on the recent policy statement was the number of times PRA used the word proportionate or proportionality. I think that's very helpful. And firms should really bear that in mind when producing their policies and doing their recalculations. A really helpful example, I think, is the 2017 recalculation process. There's a lot of debate about whether firms have to go through a full recalculation application process, a la operating change, or whether something would be a bit more streamlined and simplified. And I think we've landed at a sensible place where it's just a letter to PRA kind of stating that we plan to recalculate, and PRA will confirm back that's okay. So a very straightforward process rather than having to do reams of documentation to justify why you might want to make that change. So helpful indeed. Just a very brief summary of the session and key takeaways. So risk margin is clearly a material item of the transitional, and essentially, the transitional is about a soft landing into Solvency II, and given the materiality of the risk margin, I think the transitional's primary objective is to mitigate the introduction of the Solvency II risk margin. Calculations are complex and can be onerous, and requires at least 3 stages of calculation, as described by Susan. Recalculation is an ongoing challenge for firms. Certainly when a lot of recalculations were done last year, whilst it wasn't great to recalculate immediately after just after the implementation of Solvency II, firms did at least have the old Solvency I models at the 31st of December to look back, 2016 to look back to, which is helpful. Obviously, as we move through time, those models become less relevant, and the materiality of the transitional reduces. So there's a big onus on firms to make sure that their recalculation policy remains appropriate and proportionate. Recent changes, recent policy statement has brought clarity in a number of areas, but there's challenges still remain. And I guess the last point, or the last couple of points I have to do is to plug the paper. If you haven't read it already, it's available at the link below, and also I think on the it's also available on the invite to this session on the IFA's website. It is a thrilling read, 85 pages of pure, unadulterated joy. I'm sure you will all agree. The last thing I would mention as well is just kind of next steps on the working party. I think probably the last job we have to do, or thing that we plan to do really, is to put out another survey, or a survey on behalf of the profession to firms around just recalculation. I think that's currently jumping through the hoops at the profession before we can issue that, and then we will plan to share the results of that and via appropriate forums next year. Appreciate everybody's probably fed up with surveys on recalculation, but hopefully this will be the last and the best. So on that note, I will stop talking and hand back over to Craig.
Thank you very much, Andy. Thank you very much, Susan. We'll now open the floor to discussion. Hopefully there'll be a number of you out there with comments and observations on this. Just as I said at the start, if you could put your hand up and wait for a microphone to come round to you before speaking, that would be grand. And again, as the meeting is being recorded for publication in the British Actuarial Journal, could you please clearly state your name before making your contribution? So I now open to the floor. Oh, well, I'll go first then, to try and get some debate going. So I think for me, reading the paper and looking at the presentation, I think my overwhelming takeaway was this is pretty complicated. In fact, it's more than pretty complicated. It's hideously complicated. And I think, particularly against the backdrop of something like the Treasury Select Committee's recent pronouncement on PRA's implementation of Solvency II and how, I guess, OTT that has potentially been. Do you see there being a simplification of the methodology in the relatively near future, or not?
We did actually discuss this as a working party. It was before the Treasury Select Committee made their pronouncements, but we kind of saw it where it might actually get a bit more complex in the shorter term as PRA issues more guidance, as firms are developing the way in which they might recalculate. But then as it starts to run off and becomes less material, then obviously there'll be more scope for approximations and simplifications. So there was a matching adjustment consultation paper issued, I think, in the last few weeks, and at the very bottom of that statement, there was something from the PRA stating that they were going to continue to look at the recalculation of the TMTP. So it could be that we get something out from the PRA in the near future that does actually allow more simplifications, but it's just not known yet.
Yeah, I concur with Susan, but the recent PS statement, as I said, there's plenty of words of the use of the word proportionate. So I think there's an element of recalculation policy and being within the firm's gift and making sure that they do something that they can manage both now and in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Stephen Macon. Thanks, Andy and Susan, for a good presentation, and to the rest of the working party for the paper. It does take a huge amount of work to pull these papers together. So, a lot of sympathy with Craig's comment there that there's a huge amount of complexity, and sort of struck by the aphorism, if you could start from somewhere, it wouldn't be here. So thinking ahead to Brexit, and fingers crossed something good can actually come out of that. What are the sort of simplifications as an industry that you think we should be pushing for in the context of TMTP and its recalculation. So, maybe in the context of the three main areas you said, Andy, it was used for: risk margin, illiquidity premium, and ICG. What are the sort of things that we should be pushing hard on, do you think?
Well, risk margin is obviously an area that's going to get looked at, I think, in general, and not just in terms of the TMTP. So if there was a case after Brexit where the cost of capital associated with the risk margin actually came down, then you're going to end up with a raft of recalculations of your TMTP anyway, because it would reduce, given that you would be losing quite a big element of that. I think the PRA putting a lot of responsibility onto the audit committees for actually approving the TMTP, the amount of the TMTP, because the PRA don't approve it, the actual amount of the transitional that you have. They will approve that you've had a material change in risk profile or that you've reached the 2-year point, but then it's up to the audit committee to actually sign off that you still comply with the FRR test, that you meet all the conditions in the statutory instrument. So unless that was actually changed, it's difficult to see how you can start introducing lots and lots of simplifications unless you can actually get your own audit committee comfortable with what you're doing. I'm not sure I've answered your question, Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a cultural element within firms. I mean, I'm sure some firms are recalculating the transitional to the penny using a full but ICA and Solvency II balance sheet comparison. I'm sure other firms are being a bit more proportionate in their approach and maybe just adjusting the risk margin, the 2016 risk margin for kind of interest rates and other key risk movements. So yeah, I think recalculation is within firms' gift to a large degree.
Okay, at the back.
Hello, my name's Paul Turnbull. Need my glasses. I find this staggering. There was a major tax change in 2013. As actuaries, you may not all recall that in detail, but the HMRC adopted a rather strange approach. They said, what's the difference in the tax? And they said, run that off over 10 years. Hugely complicated. And what's happened as a result of this TMTP approach is that the SCR isn't actually the number by which solvency is measured. It's the result after applying TMTP. So all this wonderful stuff on how to calculate SCR is irrelevant because another number is the more important one, and that's a number which depends on Solvency I. And I don't know if anybody else has tried, but I have actually tried to find the old Solvency I rules on the PRA website, which, as I say, is supremely important over Solvency II. I can't actually find them. So it's kind of strange that the most important rules are not available on the PRA. Well, they might be available, but I can't find them myself. Anyway, yeah.
David Campbell. I mean, I would agree entirely with Paul, but I think what's worse than that is that the new supervisory statement means that's not just true on day one. In Andy's example, it would be true for the next 5 years as well, and it actually delays even further when the Solvency II regime starts to have an impact on companies.
We've got John over here.
John Gill, congratulate the authors as well on a comprehensive paper where you definitely worked very hard within a series of constraints to come out with as many possibilities as possible. I guess my question is, did you ever question whether the constraints were appropriate? And in particular, either the risk margin is right or it isn't. I know we took 10 years of wrangling over Solvency II to get to the end of the risk margin, but 16 years is even longer a period to live with something that may not be fundamentally sound. Did the authors question that as maybe changing the constraints might be a different way of looking at this problem?
I'd probably say we probably didn't look at changing the constraints in the way that you described. I think it was more a case of the rules are the rules. This is what we have to live with in the short term, at the very least. And how do we make the best of what we have? Of course, there's a whole other debate as to whether the risk margin is appropriate or not, and this is certainly Brexit and etc. kind of throws that into the fore as well. But I don't think it was something that we necessarily considered in detail.
No, that's right. I mean, we've got the risk margin. It's a big part of the difference between Solvency II and Solvency I. So it's how would you go about dealing with that? I mean, until the PRA came out and stated you still needed to do things with the FRR test. If the main driver of your transitional was the risk margin, the simplest calculation would be to look at the movement in your risk margin and just run that off over 16 years and ignore everything else. But the PRA did actually come out and state that they wanted you to state that you were still meeting that condition of the FRR test. And then the most recent statement is, and actually you now need to bring in new business. So it's making it a bit more complex, and it takes away from that purity of just looking at what actually drives your TMTP, and could you just look at that component?
Okay. Kate.
Kate Stewart-Roper, can you throw any light on the regulator's motivation of bringing new business into the FRR test? It seems quite hard to understand why.
I don't know their thinking. My guess would be is because they think that you need to look at a legal entity level, and so the legal entity level brings in all business, even business that's not within the scope of actually having the transitional in the first place. Because I think that's some of the reasoning. We didn't really talk about it in the presentation, but for firms that have got ring-fenced funds, the PRA's requirement to look at your legal entity solvency coverage ratio causes some issues in looking at what the 5% movement means, because when you bring in the ring-fenced funds, you don't look at the own funds associated with that. But they seem to be quite set on the legal entity component. So I think it allows easier reconciliation to what's in your QRTs. But they haven't made any statement. And although we have had a discussion with them, it's not been a topic that's come up.
I mean, I guess on that one, the thing that strikes me, I'm not sure if PRA has explicitly recognised what this actually might do to insurers' balance sheets at the end of this year, because there is, the reality is there will be a number of companies that will see a material uplift, albeit it will then change the runoff. But you are going to get a huge kicker, I think, in a number of cases at this year end, and I'm not entirely convinced that's well understood. Any other questions? Gordon at the back.
I'll go first. Mr. Turnbull can go next. A couple of miscellaneous observations. I think the first one, there's been a lot of talk about, if you want, proportionality, simplification, etc. But standardisation. I think standardisation is doomed to failure. It might be relatively straightforward to say this is the method one must use for today's Solvency II number, but obviously, as we've seen very well set out in the paper, there were quite a number of approaches in the old Solvency I Pillar 2 regime, so there's always going to be that difference. So I think my strong view is we're looking for simplification plus margins, and I absolutely agree with Andy where he says too many companies are getting into the too hideous detail. So one observation. Second observation, buried in section 4.1, I think there's a very, very important point. We might have hideous complexity, but it's our job as actuaries to make sure it's not hideously complex when presented to senior management fora and to boards. So the equivalent scenarios, be it interest rate sensitivity, be it, for example, inflation sensitivity. If you're a big BPA writer, I think it's very, very important to give the senior decision fora in the insurance companies the information they need to manage the business. And one last point, we're talking here about, in essence, a degree of detail. How does TMT run off? TMTP, I beg pardon. I think the big picture issue is, as we're going forward, more new business, more risk margin, less TMTP, no matter what the runoff pattern is. So much more sensitivity to, for example, interest rates, much more volatility on the Solvency II balance sheet. So how is we as a profession going to help our employers manage that? Thank you.
Any comments?
I think all fair points.
Paul.
Oh, yes, Paul Turnbull again. I just wondered, does Europe implement this in the same way? So are they requiring the same level of recalculation as the UK?
It's not something we've discussed in detail, but if you actually look at the article in the Level 1 Directive, there's very little in there about recalculation of the TMTP. It focuses very much on day one, and it talks about looking at the difference between your Solvency II technical provisions and those that firms were required to hold under Solvency I. It states that the supervisors may, if they choose, decide to restrict the amount of that transitional, which is what the PRA have done with the FRR test. So but we don't have any information as to how other regulators have applied that.
Yeah, because I mean, for me, it discourages risk management. If you find the old Solvency I Pillar 1 measure applies, and why would you do any further risk management until that ceases to apply? So it's actually preventing the very thing they're trying to encourage in applying Solvency II. And the point about proportionality, I mean, I get the idea that we shouldn't do too much effort, but I mean, the board's responsibility is to do the best for the shareholder, and one of the things that is important in that is minimising the need for capital. And so if you spend all this time producing Solvency II numbers, why wouldn't you spend exactly the same amount of time producing the value that constrains the dividend?
I think that's right, and I think it goes back to one of the points on, you know, the TMTP acts as a good hedge to movements in the risk margin, or it would act as a good hedge if you could have dynamic recalculation of it, and therefore, you know, you would need to consider, are you triggering management actions that you otherwise wouldn't take, or could you actually get a recalc of the TMTP?
Yeah, and I would say proportionality doesn't necessarily mean you cut every corner to come up with a fag packet number. You know, it needs to be robust and appropriate still.
I guess following on from Paul's comments, I don't know to what degree you've thought about ALM and risk management strategies that companies adopt in a world where you do have a big TMTP on your balance sheet. I mean, I guess given the potential for regulatory change, the runoff, and as Gordon discussed, the need to focus on the key underlying dynamics, do you feel that that is an area where companies truly are arbitraging the value of the transitionals in terms of risk management strategies, or is that not something that you looked at in the working party?
We haven't had a lot of information from companies in terms of that. Our focus was primarily in terms of recalculation. There is a section in the paper about ALM. It's not an area of my expertise. I think the PRA have issued statements. It was possibly a director's update or perhaps the supervisory statement from 2015, where they expect firms to still have appropriate risk management frameworks in place and ALM strategies that are not dependent on the existence of the transitional.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, kind of touching on one of Gordon's points, I think at the moment the transitional is a good hedge on interest rate risk, but you know, as we get to a point where you are at an unrestricted TMTP, the interest rate exposure on the risk margin on your post-2016 business becomes an important thing to hedge and manage. So maybe firms at the moment have the luxury of the transitional, but more thought on ALM strategy is to come in the coming years.
James here.
Thank you. Having been on the Life Board at the time the Working Party was established, it's great to see the output and depth of thinking that's come through this. One of the reflections was, why were we establishing the Working Party? We just had a meeting with the PRA, and it was clear that they hadn't worked through and weren't prepared for the issues on the recalculation of the transitionals. They'd been heavily focused on implementation of Solvency II and planned to think about this in the quiet spell immediately after the start of Solvency II coming in. Interest rates plummeted. Several companies poured in to demand recalculation of them, and they just weren't ready for it. So I think there's probably an element of careful what we wish for. There have been some firms who would have wanted just a straight, smooth runoff of the transitionals, not so exposed to interest rates and other factors, whereas others have almost relied on it, particularly in 2016, to manage their capital position. So I think some of it is driven by what we've pushed. In terms of Paul's point about Europe, I think Europe generally doesn't rely on the transitionals. It's much more a UK-focused issue. Where they do rely on in Europe, it's the other transitional, the interest rate one, so I suspect it's not as complicated a calculation that you need to think through, but coming back.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, on the point on kind of just wanting a nice, easy life with a flat runoff, you could always hedge out the residual exposure if you wanted to. Obviously, that would produce volatility on your IFRS balance sheet, as would become a naked hedge.
Michael?
Michael Kerr. I've been thinking about external disclosures, and they seem to be growing in complexity along with the growing complexity of the calculations. So you've got different approaches on the annual drop of the TMTP. I think is officially 1st of January, but it depends then if you're publishing year-end results, do you drop it before the 1st of January, so do you effectively drop it on the 31st of December? If you recalculate on a 31st December, do you include the following 1st of January's annual drop? And there was the issue last year that you mentioned about at Brexit, and lots of companies recalculated transitionals at 30th of June. By the end of the year, interest rates were higher, and a lot of companies were nervous about quoting transitionals based on such low interest rates, and so effectively came up with another form of transitional that they wanted to disclose to the market. So there does seem to be growing diversity and complexity in the message that we're giving externally about transitionals, and I was wondering if you thought that there might be any way in the future that there might be a bit more standardisation, or companies might come to a more uniform view on how they're actually going to message transitionals externally.
Yeah, that's a difficult one to answer. I think all the observations you make are fair. I think I saw a recent survey that suggested maybe 50% of companies were running off at the 31st of December and 50% are running off at the 1st of January, which obviously has implications for your 31 December balance sheet that you publish. Yeah, I mean, keep saying transitionals are complex and there's lots of ways of doing it, and I think that just kind of flows through into how people report it and show it as well. One of the Working Party paper does suggest that maybe a more dynamic recalculation might be appropriate, and that would certainly avoid having to give two sets of numbers in reports accounts if you're worried about the level of your underlying transitional versus what you've actually calculated or got on the on your Solvency II balance sheet. Yeah, it feels like one of these ones where Solvency II was trying to standardise, but really we're not anywhere near that.
EIOPA issued some guidance prior to year-end 16 that tried to pick up on that 1st January versus 31st December issue. And they did state that if you don't run it off, they know that the rules recognise that the rules sort of state it's 1st January, but that a lot of firms actually report as at 31st December. And if you didn't include that run-off as at the 31st of December, you're supposed to be disclosing a position that's a true and fair reflection of the firm, and therefore you would have to do some sort of supplementary disclosure to say that, but actually the next day you're going to lose that amount of the TMTP. I think they also stated that although it refers to an annual run-off, you could run it off quarterly to tie in with the quarterly balance sheet reporting, so you don't get such a step change at the end of the year. The PRA put a bit in their update to SS 616 that tried to cover a bit of disclosures and stated that you could have a notional amount disclosed as part of your supplementary information, but they would expect you to take a consistent approach when you were reporting internally, so within your ORSAs and things like that. But whether we actually get standardisation, unless they were to come out and say, you know, you can't disclose more than the maximum, even if it's in the supplementary information, I don't think we would get that.
Yeah. The bottom line is you can have different approaches in your forms across firms, and the details, the devil that is in the detail, it's buried somewhere in your disclosures that analysts may or may not choose to read or understand.
The back.
Ian Rogers. Just interested in the extent to which, I guess following on from James's comment about this working party being set up on the basis of the PRA not really having had a chance to think about this fully, the extent to which you feel that the PRA have listened to your thoughts on recalculation, and to what extent your work has shaped the regime we now find ourselves in terms of the way that the recalculation works.
That's a good question, Ian. It's difficult to second guess what the PRA have come to the conclusion. I think one of the conclusions of our paper is that it's very difficult to get a one-size-fits-all, and therefore it's needed to be firm-specific. And so it's very helpful that the PRA haven't actually stipulated how you should actually go about doing a recalculation. So we'd perhaps like to think that that's helped. There was also an ABI working party that were feeding in quite a bit to the consultation papers that were going out. So yeah, I think the only thing I can say is that it's helpful that the PRA haven't stipulated how it should be recalculated.
Yeah, I think probably should view that as an opportunity rather than a constraint. And certainly the PRA, we engaged the PRA as a working party before we published our paper, and they certainly had a good look at it. I'm not sure I was privy to those conversations, but I don't think there's any material objections to the way it was originally drafted. So there's almost a bit of approval by the back door there, I guess. Influence.
Any more questions? Well, I'm going to ask one last one anyway. I think one of the things that came out in reading the paper, and you also alluded to it in the slide deck, was the working party's preference for a dynamic resetting of transitionals. And I guess good management of your balance sheet should see you calculating the value of the transitionals anyway outside a formal reset environment and forecasting it forward for business planning. So I suppose my question was, what do you think the real benefit of introducing that dynamic reset would be against what should be best practice at the moment anyway?
I think I agree with you that firms should be, keeping an eye on the underlying value of the transitional, and certainly they have to do that because we need to look at whether you meet your reset triggers. So that's certainly something that firms should be doing. I guess the point is that firms should be doing that, and if they are doing that, then why go to have the distraction of having to do formal applications every so often? So I guess it saves having a policy where a pre-agreed approach to recalculate saves distraction for both firms and PRA alike. The other aspect I would say is around clarity of information both to decision makers, boards, and also external external publications. It's nicer to have one number than having two numbers with a lot of commentary around it.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Any other questions from the floor? I think everybody's getting hungry or just ready to go home. So I think, thank you very much. What I'll do, I'll just wrap up, I think, my key takes on it. So I think a very interesting discussion. We started off with Susan describing the methodologies of the calculation of the TMTP, which has led on to, I guess, quite a debate on technical and practical challenges. I think for me, an overriding theme from a number of contributions was definitely around about the complexity of it and benefits that we might get from simplification. Paul Turnbull gave a very helpful analogy from tax changes 4 to 5 years ago and how that was implemented quite simply. And you look at that against what we're faced with here, and it does seem a little bit different. I think Gordon's contribution is a very valid one. I think it's important, excusing the pun and the surname, that we do see the wood from the trees and in all of this, Gordon, that we do focus on what we're trying to manage once the transitionals have run off materially and are no longer there, and that is what should drive good practice. I think we talked a little bit in a similar vein about risk management and ALM, and whether or not we had companies taking advantage of the TMTP and coming up with practices there. I'm not sure we had any compelling insight on that one. Probably, again, it's obviously not something that it was within your terms of reference in the working party, but I think remains an interesting one if we could get some information on that. And again, I think other helpful things that have come out, just this issue about standardisation generally, an issue of runoff on 31st December or 1st of January is a very good example of where we can potentially influence that standardisation process to get people operating in a similar vein would be, I think, very, very helpful. And then finally, question, has PRA listened to what the working party has done? Well, not necessarily directly plugged into it. I think it was helpful to hear your views that, I think the lack of prescription from PRA does actually feel like that is very helpful in this area, and that the reality is that it isn't a one-size-fits-all case of calculation and application of transitionals across the industry. So I think for me, this is obviously an area that will continue to attract a lot of focus going forward. I think the only thing that is certain is we probably will see a bit more change. Things like changes in the way in which the risk margin is calculated, for example, would be an obvious one. If we change underlying cost of capital and the impact that then has on transitionals, I will be amazed if things remain static over the next few years. So I think very interesting debate all round. A big thanks from me to both Susan and Andy for a really good contribution. Thanks to everybody else who's contributed from the floor. I think that has really helped in terms of having a good evening and getting a good debate going. So we could just thank Susan and Andy in particular in the usual fashion. Thank you very much.